Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Library is Open. So I hope you brought your library card, darling. Not sure what that was, but I kind of liked it, so let's go with it. I'm going to try and keep this one reasonably short. I know I say that every time, hands up, but I'm having some issues with the space on my phone at the moment. Basically, I think it's on its way out, so it's telling me there's not enough storage, so on and so forth, blah. So I will attempt to keep this short. First and foremost, a little bit of housekeeping though. Thank you so much to everybody who interacted with, watched, listened to, etc. My new performance poetry piece, Your Nose, which I wrote for the end of Pride Month on behalf of one of my students who is graduating this year and has a performance company who is making a digital event to celebrate the end of Pride Month. So if you haven't seen that yet, I will link that in the pinned comment, as I am now aware of how to properly convey information in the box. The description box, read the Black Lives Matter resources, which are still an ongoing thing, and so I can use the pinned comments for other things as well, which is great. So I'm glad about that, because I think it's important that all that Black Lives Matter stuff be there throughout, as it is a movement and not a moment, which is really important, particularly for those of us that consider ourselves allies. We got to keep doing that work and keep signing those petitions, keep emailing people, keep sharing information, and actively being entirely opposed to racism. So, and undoing systemic racism, I should say. So that being said, as I say, welcome back, and today I would like to talk about quite a short book, another classic, as it were, of the gothic or sensationalist genre, another Victoriana novel. As you know, I'm a massive fan of Victoriana, both in fiction and also the kind of culture aesthetic around it, particularly with regards to spiritualism and horror and so on and so forth. And I thought I'd discuss this that's particularly pertinent to me, and I'll tell you why in a second. But first of all, here is the book we are talking about today, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Pretty sure everyone's heard of this in at least one incarnation or another. There have been many films, TV, even musical theatre adaptations of it. Yeah, there's a Broadway show, I think, a few years. Yes, there was a Broadway show a few years ago. I say a few years ago, that could be any time in the last 2 decades. As time is relative. But actually, having revisited the book now as part of a project, which I will explain, it's really, really interesting to see and to compare different incarnations of the same property. Because if you look, that's actually how long the book is. This book also contains other stories by Robert Louis Stevenson, famously the author of Treasure Island. And yeah, so it's really interesting to see where films, TVs, musicals, so on and so forth have added additional subplots or different narrative threads in order to flesh out the book, which is a slim 74 pages, I believe, which is interesting. So we'll all be familiar, or we may all be familiar with the concept of the penny dreadful in Victorian fiction, which was, as the name suggests, a sort of quite sensationalist fiction, usually focused around the supernatural that people could, or sort of deeds of daring that people could buy for a penny. It was what was called or sneered at as cheap fiction, although oftentimes I think cheap fiction is just a way of dismissing popular fiction, which is not the same thing at all. This one is described as, came out in 1886 and it's described as a shilling shocker. So slightly more expensive but then again, who am I to judge? Well, I am me to judge, because that is essentially what this channel is. So I've been rereading this, and I'm just going to summarise the plot basically, just in case there are some of you who are not familiar with it. It's kind of, the plot's kind of worked its way into our sort of national or global consciousness in many ways, because it's been reiterated so many different ways. But basic premise is we have our lead character, who is Dr. Henry Jekyll, who's a scientist but also a man of God, a self-professed man of God, and he becomes obsessed with the idea of the duality of human beings. He says man, but he means human beings, I believe. How we have the massive propensity for good in us, and charity and giving and caring, but we also have this equally massive propensity for what he describes as evil, selfishness, pursuit of your own interests, so on and so forth, base, acts that we would consider criminal, or so on and so forth. And so what he does is he gets this idea that if good and bad exist in the one person, it would be a really great idea to distill the good and distill the bad as well, so that by removing the bad from the good would be made even better, because it wouldn't be tainted by the bad. So what he does is he brews up this tincture, potion, that transforms him into the bad half of himself, which he calls Mr. Edward Hyde. So Hyde represents all of Henry Jekyll's unexpressed desires, but this soon turns murderous, and Edward Hyde kind of goes on a rampage. And we discover that Henry Jekyll is then unable to rein him in, and also to control when Mr. Hyde appears, because obviously they share the same body. So things spiral out of control quickly. Interestingly, we don't actually hear Dr. Henry Jekyll / Edward Hyde's voice in the book until the very last chapter, which is kind of a testimonial. It's like found evidence by the other characters in the book who discover a sort of record that he's made of what happened. Prior to that, we actually see events unfold, and it's quite a clever device, really, because it sort of teases out events without giving us conclusions. Things that have led up to or are a part of the discovery of the testimony by Dr. Henry Jekyll. So we get a lot of the perspective of, although it is in the third person, of a lawyer character called Gabriel Utterson, who's a friend of Henry's. And then there is also a chapter that is a doctor friend of his as well, Dr. Lanyon, who sort of puts his two penneth in, as it were. And then finally, all the pieces come together in the final chapter, chapter 10, which is, as I say, Dr. Jekyll's testimony. I do apologise, we got cut off there. I'll just try and pick straight back up. What this does is it's really quite clever, because it kind of operates as a kind of gothic whodunit, if you will, because the information we receive as we go along is sort of doled out in a non-linear way as the other characters surrounding the story discover it. So it's up to us, assuming we had no prior knowledge of the story, which we kind of do now because it is a trope, it kind of keeps us intrigued and keep going as we try to piece together the pieces of the mystery and discover, because as far as the characters in the book are concerned, Edward Hyde exists, but he isn't Dr. Jekyll. He's like an associate or someone he knows who has a hold over Dr. Jekyll. So we don't necessarily have that information until we reach the end and discover that they are in fact one and the same person. Spoiler. So it's really interesting I always think, to go back to the original source of a piece of work, particularly one that we know so well, and to examine how adaptations of it have spun off different narratives, because they kind of have to. Like with a film or so on and so forth, you have to, if it's a massive book, you've got to slim it down to the essentials. Third time's the charm. Or if it's a shorter story, obviously you've got to flesh it out. So for instance, the Broadway musical version recently, as I say, about 20 years ago, added in a romantic subplot to further complicate, and also a subplot involving Dr. Henry Jekyll's father in an asylum, and so on and so forth, and really sort of managed to flesh out those characters. Obviously a short story doesn't need to do that, so it is interesting. And I mention this because the reason I was rereading this book, which I haven't read for years, is because I have been in the process of preparing an adaptation myself. So I've been working with a company, or a theatre company I should say, or performance company, who are currently creating digital content online using the Facebook Live app to live stream performance work. So basically it's all acted out live in the person's home, the actor's home I should say, and then it's streamed live on Facebook sort of in one shot, which is fantastic and really innovative. And they have done already The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, a new play about technology and its effect on us, sort of Siri and intelligent design and so on and so forth. And the third piece is going to be, I believe it's August August, I believe it's August it's going to go out, but to be confirmed, I will be Jekyll and Hyde by my good self. And I want to talk a tiny little bit about my approach to that, because I was aware that I had certain restrictions on the process. So I had one actor, and the obvious choice there is to, well, for storytelling purposes, is to make Dr. Henry Jekyll / Edward Hyde the protagonist of the piece, because I'm aware that to use anybody else would sort of be almost a betrayal of the audience, because that's what they expect. And also it gives me an opportunity to do more than just a straight translation of the book, and to really sort of flesh out ideas surrounding the duality of man, the dichotomous forces of good versus evil, religion versus science, so on and so forth. So I approached the adaptation by centering Jekyll Hyde as the main character, and having the other characters respond through voiceover and so on and so forth, which is, really quite evocative, those sort of sounds, but without people we can see. But also, it does what a lot of Shakespeare plays used to do in the past through the function of the chorus, which was, if they weren't able to show massive big scenes on stage, they just told you about it. So it's the one time when tell me, don't show me is actually appropriate, when you don't have the resources to be able to show us. So we tell you, and we do that most cleverly, I believe, through voiceover, illusion, and, this sort of idea of fullness that's not literal. So we get the sounds of that, and that's important. So yeah, I decided to start the piece at the end of the book where we finish up, and actually, rather than treat the whole issue of the duality of Jekyll and Hyde as a revelation, we're aware of it from the very beginning, and we sort of go backwards from Henry Jekyll's desperation to him explaining himself, as though he's writing the testimony but speaking it instead. What I think this also allows us to do is to, I say us, I mean me, sort of recenter where the focus of the story is, of interest for the audience, that they want to see that transformation. And for the actor as well, Jekyll into Hyde is a really interesting transformational exercise, purely using the body, particularly on this platform, so that's fascinating. Although, interesting sidebar, there is also an essay in this short story collection about what does Edward Hyde look like, because I think a lot of people have portrayed Henry Jekyll as this sort of meek, mild doctor, and Edward Hyde as this sort of monstrous, humongous beast. But interestingly enough, going back to the original text, actually Mr. Hyde is seen as smaller, almost as if he shrunk back into himself, like he's been distilled into purely the bad or base elements of Henry Jekyll. Look at that beam. Is she wearing highlighter? No. She's just got net curtains. And actually, there is something even scarier about that, isn't there? Because although there's nothing, there is something to the idea of this sort of rampaging, beast-like, bestial monster rampaging through Victorian London. Actually, someone who's able to blend in, who is, tiny, reptilian, kind of sleek and built for utility, as he sort of goes on these murderous rampages, is almost scarier because they're hiding in plain sight. So yeah, that's what I've been working on basically. I just wanted to discuss that because I think it's really interesting in how we, look at literature, and then how literature is expressed in different forms, and are allowed to be. And these forms, are allowed to be separate entities which contribute to the legend or the sort of vibe of the original source material. I know there's a popular misconception, I believe it to be a misconception, that, when a book is turned into a film, and people don't like the film adaptation, they're like, oh, it's ruined the book for me. Well, no, because the book is still there on your shelf. It always exists. This is just something else. And I think that's probably the best way to go. Other than that, as I say, there's things that work in books that would not work in performance, because while books can be reflective, performance rarely is, because it has to be active, because it's an active art form. So and I think being able to flesh out Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Jekyll. He's not a Docker. Dr. Jekyll and Edward Hyde as separate parts of the same person is really just has been a treat for me to sort of explore those ideas that are inherent, I believe, in the text and try to bring them to life in a new way that has something different to say to the story. Now, so that's interesting. So keep your eyes out for that, and I will, obviously, when it launches, let you know how it's going. But yeah, I would recommend this. It's a nice, quick afternoon read, and it really, just to return to this idea that, things that you know really well, when you go back to them, are often not what you remember them to be, which is a really interesting thing about storytelling, isn't it? It's like every time the story gets told, something is either added or removed. So you could sort of say that there is a chain of stories all stemming from one story that are all independent of the original source, but all also beholden to it. It's fascinating. It's a memory exercise that I don't quite have time to do right now because my phone is telling me that it's not appreciating how much I'm filming today. So I'm going to cut it short there and say thank you for watching / listening. I will be back. I'm looking to go back to once a week at the moment with my uploads, I'm afraid. Although I originally tended to do more over COVID, I have quite a heavy work thing on at the moment online, so that's going to keep me busy. So it'll just be one a week for now, but that's okay. Parcel me out. Let me know down in the comments if you've read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or seen the films or what your perceptions are, so on and so forth, and what you think about adaptations as well. Also let me know what you're reading. If you want to follow me on the social medias, twitter.com/Stuart, A-R-T in capitals, Crowther, all one word, or on Instagram as my drag alter ego, Creeping Miasma. And again, if you haven't watched Your Nose, which I created last week, I will put the link in the pinned comment. Put those library cards away now and make sure they're safe and somewhere dry, because you know what the weather's been like at the moment. Ridiculous. And I will see you on the next episode of The Library is Open for much revelations and more tea. Lots of love. Take care of yourselves. Mwah.